Today, we are going to talk about the various social, domestic, and foreign policies of the United States. And looking at business policy, we have a mixed economy with free trade. There are some government regulations put in place. We do use tariffs, which are taxes on our imports. The reason we do this is to protect American businesses. And our economy is driven around the idea of competition, the competition to keep prices low and make our quality of products better. Some of the regulations that have been put in place, you have the Sherman and Clayton Antitrust Acts, which their goal is to break up monopolies. You have the Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC. It's an independent agency that monitors business practices. You also have consumer protection laws. One agency is the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, and that holds companies to certain food standards. The SEC, or the Securities and Exchange Commission, is going to monitor the sale of stocks and make sure that investors and companies are faithfully involved in the stock market. And looking at the labor policy, you have collective bargaining, which is the idea that people can negotiate labor contracts. You have unions that protect workers, federal laws that establish child labor laws, maximum work hours, minimum wages, things like that. The Department of Labor really helps to try to find people jobs, to train people. They collect data. They offer unemployment insurance. And a lot of this has to go back to the 1930s with the Great Depression. The collective bargaining and right to strike really came about during the 1930s with the National Labor Relations Board enforcing these changes that were made. They also started regulating unions, which you had the creation of what were called closed shops, where if you worked in a union, you could be hired. If you were not part of the union, businesses wouldn't hire you. So they made right to work. The government made right to work laws, and people then had the option to join various labor unions. The Landrum-Griffin Act of 1959 made it a federal crime to misuse union funds. So this helped protect union members from intimidation by officials, and it was essentially a Bill of Rights for union members. And looking at agriculture, you have the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA. You may hear about food being USDA approved, but they control most of the federal policy. Most of the policy still comes from the 1930s and the New Deal, where they want to limit oversupplied crops. They'll provide loans. Typically, you'll have a farm bill passed every 5 to 7 years to stimulate agriculture. And they also created programs for stabilizing prices. Price supports were put in place in case you have bad weather conditions and a crop fails. The government can restrict support for certain crops to avoid a surplus, meaning they'll provide subsidies for growing certain types of crops. The government will pay you more money to grow certain crops that might be different than what you typically grow. Our environmental policy, the government did not have an environmental policy for many years. It was typically controlled by the states. In the 1970s, the government created the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, to help formulate this policy. Recently, President Trump has ended the EPA, so it'll be interesting to see kind of how that environmental policy shifts moving forward. We've also had the Clean Air Act, which controls air pollution, the Water Pollution Control Act, meaning people need permits to dump waste into waterways. You also have unfunded mandates. So an example would be, if you look since 2001, the government has imposed more than $100 billion in new unfunded mandates. And going back to what we talked about earlier, these can really kind of be crippling to the states. Our energy policy, it involves how energy is produced. In 1973 and 74, we were in an energy crisis. Arab countries had cut off our oil shipments because of our support for Israel, and it forced the U.S. to look for more efficient and alternative forms of energy. The latest method of finding energy is what we call fracking. It is where we look for shale rocks, essentially shake them in order to release the gases that we can use then for energy. Income security policy. This resulted because of the Great Depression. We had the Social Security Act, which provided old age insurance, public assistance for the aged, blind, and the disabled, and unemployment insurance. So when you pay Social Security out of your paycheck, this is what you pay into the Social Security fund that is divided amongst people who qualify. Some people today fear that it will run out because of the baby boomer generation retiring. And there have been a number of possible solutions, including raising the retirement age, privatizing the account, reducing benefits, and things like that. But so far, there really haven't been many changes. They did raise the age of retirement slightly, but that was a while back. They provide unemployment insurance. So if you're let go, you can receive unemployment. You also have SNAP, or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which those are food stamps. Healthcare, we have the Affordable Care Act, also called Obamacare. If you want a funny skit to watch, Google Affordable Care Act, Jimmy Kimmel. He asks people around, I believe, LA, which they like better, the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, and they don't realize it's the same thing. But it's fairly entertaining. But anyway, it expanded Medicaid and prevented insurance companies from denying coverage. It requires all Americans to buy health insurance, large companies to provide health insurance to their employees. When it was being passed, it was very heated. I know President Trump, one of his main platforms was trying to remove the Affordable Care Act. With Medicare, you have it's a government program that pays the medical bills for senior citizens that can't afford it. Medicaid is a program that pays for low-income people and their health services. So, and I've thrown in CHIP, or Children's Health Insurance Program. That applies. Essentially, it's Medicaid for children. We also have Veterans Affairs, Public Health Service, Center for Disease Control that keep an eye and help with public health issues. And then there are also organizations like NASA, the National Institute of Health, and the National Science Foundation that help provide research for healthcare policies. Education policy. So the government provides federal aid to primary and secondary schools as well as higher education. The GI Bill gave veterans aid to attend college after they return home from war. Federal education policy debates. So you've got various issues in dealing with schools. Some want to look at other countries and see what they are doing and why they are so successful. You also had the creation of Common Core in math and science, which you all probably see that on a daily basis. Or not math and science, I'm sorry, math and English, which you see on a daily basis. You also have school choice and public charter schools that were created. Housing and urban development that focuses on the promotion of home buying, as well as public housing programs and housing for low-income families that's government subsidized. Transportation policy. You've got a number of different organizations, including the Federal Highway Administration, Federal Railway Administration, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. They are the ones that come up with the witty sayings on the highways that you see. Building and maintaining highways. They also build mass transit systems like subways and trains and things like that. They're responsible for the city bus systems, things like that. Citizenship policy. You are a citizen by birth. If you are born in the country, you can also become a citizen through naturalization, which requires you to be a legal resident for 5 years. You need to live within the United States for at least half of the last 5 years. You need to be 18, have good moral character, the ability to speak, read, and write in English, pass a citizenship test about history and government, or American history and government, and you need to swear allegiance to the Constitution and loyalty to the U.S. Immigration. Congress has sole power over naturalization. They initially preferred people from Europe. They also, in our history, we have restricted Asian immigrants with the Chinese Exclusion Act. One tool they use is a quota where they allow only a certain number of immigrants in. The Immigration and Nationality Act was created to kind of help reunify families and give priority to people of certain skills. Efforts have been made to control illegal immigration. The Immigration Reform and Control Act tried to limit undocumented immigrants. It penalized employers who knowingly hired undocumented immigrants. Many policies have really changed since 9/11. And you can even look at Syria recently with our quota on the number of Syrian refugees and people being afraid of ISIS. Currently, people agree that there needs to be a reform. The question is, it's really tough to decide how to handle children. You look at everything that's going on, and typically a 5-year-old child isn't going to be the one responsible. Their parents are going to be responsible for the decision to either immigrate illegally or whatever the circumstances may be. And then I'm sure you guys have heard this, but President Trump's desires to build a wall on the border between Mexico and the United States. So now we're going to shift gears and focus on foreign policy. You have 5 goals with foreign policy. You have national security, economic interests, world peace. You want to promote democracy, and you have a concern for humanity. The U.S., a brief history about the U.S., we were isolationists until the late 1800s when we became industrialized and we needed raw materials and new markets. So we turned to imperialism and established colonies in the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and Samoa. We built the Panama Canal. And after seeing the impact of World War I, we returned back to isolationism. After World War II, we adopted a policy of containment to stop the spread of communism. The U.S. provided aid to anti-communist resistance movements in Afghanistan, Nicaragua, Angola, Cambodia, as well as other countries. We also stockpiled nuclear weapons to fight the Soviet Union. During this time, you had Korea and Vietnam. We joined South Korea, which was democratic, and fought with the communist North Korea for 3 years until an armistice was signed. We joined South Vietnam, which was also democratic. Technically, we only fought for 10 years, but we were really involved for much longer, dating back to, I believe, the late 1950s, early 1960s. Troops were pulled out in 73, and South Vietnam is going to fall in 1975. That moves to today with September 11th. After the terrorist attacks, our goal has been to be proactive instead of reactive when it comes to stopping international terrorism. We also invaded Afghanistan and drove out the Taliban, and we wanted to establish a representative government. We also invaded Iraq because we believed or claimed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. We quickly won and were able to capture Saddam, but weapons of mass destruction were never actually found. We established free elections, withdrew in 2010, and then went back in 2014 to fight ISIS. And looking at the tools of foreign policy, we've got diplomatic tools, which include coming up to agreements through negotiation and public diplomacy. And some world organizations that help with that are the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund. You could also use the UN as well. There are economic tools to achieve foreign policy goals, including sanctions, foreign aid, and trade agreements. There are military tools through alliances and actual military force. Today, you have a lot of covert operations, as well as another tactic would be blockades. The president has a very important role in terms of foreign policy. They command the military, they appoint ambassadors, they make treaties, they use the CIA to gain intelligence. Congress also has an important role because they approve the treaties and appointments, and they also are involved with international trade and commerce. So I know that was a ton, but now you know most of the policies in regards to the U.S. government, as well as our role in foreign policy. Thank you for listening.